Don't forget to like, subscribe.
Emission gaps report and emissions gap report, and what are the key findings of this report. All these details we must have to understand. Let us get into the details. So recently United Nations Environment Program, okay, so it was released by, or it is being released by United Nations Environment Program every year, okay. So it has released a report titled the Emission Gaps Report Broken Record for 2023, okay. So this year they have titled it as Broken Record. So what record have they broken, or what target that they have fixed was not reached? That is what we need to understand, okay. So it states that urgent climate action is crucial to avoid alarming trajectory of temperature rise. So they have given utmost importance to temperature rise in this particular report, okay. And then the report is the 14th edition in a series that brings together many of the world's top climate scientists to look at the future trends in the greenhouse gas emissions and provide potential solutions to the challenge of the global warming. So every year this climate scientist will gather together, and then that is the responsibility of this United Nations Environment Program, okay. So they all gather together and then discuss about the greenhouse gas emissions and release a report based on the discussion, okay. So this is the 14th edition of such a report, okay. What else do we have to understand from this news? What is emission gap report? That we need to understand. What is emission gap? That we need to understand. So emission gap report is United Nations Environment Program's spotlight report, which is launched annually. Such information are also important, okay, because it is being released annually. Questions based on these information can also be asked, that whether it is released annually or biannually or biennially and other details, okay. And then it is done in advance of the annual climate negotiation. Every year climate negotiation is happening under UNFCCC. We all know that, United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change, okay. So before every climate change negotiation, this report will be released annually, okay. So that is what we need to know. Next, what is this emission gap report? What is that gap here? So it tracks the gap between two things. What are they? One is where the global emissions are heading with the current country commitments. Currently countries have commitments, and where the global emissions are heading to, and then where they ought to be to limit the warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So the gap in this, between these two, is the emission gap, okay. And why 1.5 degrees Celsius? Because this was the target fixed in the Paris Agreement of 2015, okay. Again, Paris Agreement belongs to this UNFCCC, okay, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. What else do we have to understand? What are all the key highlights of the report? First thing is temperature rise, like we already saw in the first slide itself, okay. So temperature rise trajectory, what is it? So the current pledges under the Paris Agreement set the world on a course for 2.5 to 2.9 degrees Celsius temperature rise above the pre-industrial levels by the end of this century, okay. To limit the warming to 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius, substantial emission cuts of 28 to 42% by 2030 is necessary, okay. So we need to cut the emissions to the range of 28 to 42% before the year 2030. Then only we can achieve this target, that is 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius below the pre-industrial levels, okay. This is one key highlight. Next is global emission trends. How are global emission trends all over the world? First thing is the greenhouse gas emissions hit a record of 57.4 gigatons. So it is a new record, which means greenhouse gas emission is increasing, which is a major concern here. So 57.4 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent in 2022. So in the year 2022, this much gigatons, that is 57.4 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent of greenhouse gas emissions. Generally, greenhouse gas emissions are measured in carbon dioxide equivalent, okay, CO2 equivalent, okay. In the year 2022, this has been observed, and this is 1.2% increase from the previous year. This is also important. Next is the greenhouse gas emissions across the G20, okay, across the G20 countries also increased by the same percentage, that is 1.2% in the year 2022. However, members vary widely in their trends. Not all G20 countries are contributing to increase in greenhouse gas emissions, but then there are countries who are decreasing their greenhouse gas emissions also. That is also important, okay. So the trend varies widely. How? With increase of greenhouse gas emissions in China, India, Indonesia and United States of America, but then greenhouse gas emission is being decreased in countries like Brazil, European Union and Russian Federation, okay. So this is also important. These three countries or the union is decreasing, but then the countries like China, India, Indonesia and United States are increasing its greenhouse gas emission. This is what we need to know. But on an average, there is an increase, okay. So increase of 1.2%, which means these countries are contributing a lot. Next is collectively the G20 countries accounts for 76% of the global emission, okay. So statements like these are very important from your exam point of view, okay. So they account for 76% of the global emissions. This is what we need to know. What else? What other highlights do we have to understand from this news article? Emissions from the major economic sectors, okay. So there are certain economic sectors which contribute to maximum emissions, okay. Such sectors are called as major emission sectors. What are they? So emissions can be split into 5 major economic sectors. The first one is energy supply. Next is industry sector. Next is agriculture and land use change and forestry, okay. This is the third one. Transport, buildings. So these are all the 5 major economic sectors which contribute to maximum emissions, okay. So in the year 2022, energy supply was the largest source of emission at 20.9 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent, that is 36% of the total. And then comes industry, which is 25%, followed by agriculture, and then this land use change and forestry sector, which contributes to 18%. Next comes transport and then building. Same, in the same order, okay. The same order, it is decreasing, which means energy supply sector has the highest emission contribution, okay, which is emitting a lot of greenhouse gases. That is what we need to understand. And then the percentage here is 36%, okay. So these are all the major economic sectors which is contributing to a lot of greenhouse gas emissions that we need to know. What else do we have to understand? Net zero pledges. So what are net zero pledges and are countries complying to it? This we need to understand. Although countries have made net zero pledges, none of the G20 countries are reducing emissions at the pace consistent with their targets, okay. So net zero pledges are being made by many countries, and of the G20 countries, none of the countries are meeting their targets, which is very important. Before that, we need to understand what is this net zero concept. Net zero means net zero emission. Net zero emission of what? Greenhouse gases. So net zero means carbon dioxide emissions are still generated. Net zero does not mean that we are not going to emit carbon dioxide at all, but then carbon dioxide will be emitted, but an equal amount of carbon dioxide is removed from the atmosphere as is released into it. That is what is important. So the net is zero. It is not complete absolute zero, but the net is zero, which means equal amount of carbon dioxide is removed from the atmosphere as is released into the atmosphere, that thus resulting in zero increase in the net emission, okay. So this target or this pledge has been made by many countries, but then they are not meeting their targets. That is what the highlight is. And then even in the most optimistic scenario, the likelihood of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius is only 14%, okay. This is a major concern. So even in the likelihood of in the most optimistic scenario, this is not possible. That is what they are saying, and it is just 14%, okay. So we need to take a lot of efforts to achieve this target of limiting the temperature rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius before 2100. That is what the target which has been fixed by the Paris Agreement. Okay, so this is what we need to know about this emission gaps report. Okay,